everyone, I'm Tanya Rivero. President Trump told reporters today that he has given up his bid to include a citizenship question on the 2020 census. Paula Reed reports from the White House that the president believes he has found another way to find out who's a citizen and who isn't.
It is essential that we have a clear breakdown of the number of citizens and non-citizens that make up the U.S. populations.
President Trump introduced an executive order late today directing his administration to collect citizenship information from everyone in the U.S.
We are pursuing a new option to ensure a complete and timely count of the non-citizen population.
The order directs federal agencies to search available databases for information on whether someone is in the U.S. legally.
It will be, we think, far more accurate.
The move ended the president's quest to add a citizenship question to the 2020 census, which critics argue would have discouraged undocumented immigrants from participating.
Can you believe? Are you a citizen of the United States of America? Sir, you can't ask that question. Why?
2 weeks ago, the Supreme Court blocked the administration's effort to add the question, ruling the administration had not provided a sufficient justification for it. The government then began printing census forms without it. But President Trump vowed to continue fighting.
$15 to $20 billion, and you're not allowed to ask them, are you a citizen? But we're fighting very hard against a system that's a very difficult system.
For the president, continuing the battle for a citizenship count is politically advantageous.
I think that the chaos is purposeful. I think that he wants to create fear.
Vanita Gupta is a former Obama Justice Department official who opposes adding the citizenship question.
There's no question that there has already been significant damage, even by the sheer specter of the question being on and all of the kind of ensuing noise from the Trump administration.
Let's bring in now Kim Wehle. Kim is a CBS News legal analyst and author of the new book, How to Read the Constitution and Why. Kim, this executive order would mandate that all agencies and departments share data that they've collected about citizens and non-citizens, correct? Will there be a legal challenge to that?
Well, it depends on whether there are any regulatory or statutory limitations on one agency sharing information with another agency. Presumably, for example, if a federal employee or contractor underwent a top secret security clearance background check, that is not the kind of information that would necessarily be freely shared. But this is really, I think, a public relations kind of covering the president's position on this, frankly, because the Census Bureau already collects citizenship information on a different document called the American Community Survey. It's not one that is attached to the census, but this is data that the government has been collecting, maybe not in the most comprehensive way. But I think the other thing to point out is the president's not saying that he's doing a data collection from individual people. That would become a problem under the Federal Records Act. That has to be vetted before the government can get information directly from citizens. And in addition, the president mentioned gerrymandering and this idea that the information could be used to decide districts, voting districts. But it's unclear whether the federal government, even if it collects within the federal government in one database this information, if that could be automatically shared with the states. The states draw up those districts, not the federal government. So I think nothing that Attorney General Barr said was incorrect. What the president said in terms of suggesting that the Democrats or there's some political push to forbid this information from being collected, that's just not accurate. I don't think legally this really makes much of a change. It's about moving information within the federal government, and I doubt without a Freedom of Information Act request, which takes months, the public or the press will even know what this actually produces.
So then do you see this, all the pomp and circumstance around this executive order, do you see this as a kind of showboating, just saving face with his base?
I do, because Mr. Barr said, listen, we don't have the time to go through the proper legal challenges to either change the rationale for adding the citizenship question, which was what the Commerce Secretary had a problem with at the Supreme Court, or doing it by executive order. Both of those things are going to face legal challenges, and Mr. Barr correctly said there just is not enough time. There's a hard deadline under the Census Act, the statute governing this, April 1st, 2020. So regardless of whether the printing presses could print faster, even if we stretch this out a few weeks, the legal challenges would not be resolved in time for the printing for April 1st. So this is a done deal for the 2020 census, and this executive order is not going to change anything with respect to the census. It's not going to change anything with respect to the information used by the census in terms of determining how many representatives in Congress each state gets.
Right.
He mentioned gerrymandering. That's different. That's how you carve up the districts once you decide how many representatives each state gets, deciding what a district is. It's not going to change the number of representatives per state, which I think there's record evidence that was one of the objectives behind adding this, was to have a smaller count for blue states, for individuals, and to allow for blue districts. And secondly, it's not going to affect federal funding for states, which is another outcome of the actual census. The census numbers will not change by virtue of this executive order. So I would say it is window dressing. It's political cover for the president, who fought so hard after the Supreme Court. And it looks like his lawyers came back and said, listen, the Supreme Court's decision stands. We cannot get around it. And I think, frankly, that's a good thing for the separation of powers. It's a good thing for democracy. It's a good thing for the integrity of our constitutional system.
Also with us is CBS News correspondent Ben Tracy. Ben, do you share Kim's view that this was all a little bit of much ado about nothing in light of the fact that the Supreme Court's decision will stand?
It's hard to avoid the politics of this. I mean, when you heard the president open his mouth there at the very beginning in the Rose Garden and kind of mockingly ask that question, are you a citizen, and say, oh, gee, we used to be able to ask these kinds of questions, that was a variation of what he does on the campaign trail, a toned-down variation, a more, I guess you would say, presidential variation of that. But it had the feeling of some of the things that he likes to kind of riff on and rail about when he is out there on the trail, saying that they, the kind of anonymous they, are trying to take away the very definition of what it means to be a citizen, that we can't even ask these kinds of questions anymore. So certainly there were some politics here. And I thought one of the really interesting things is what you did not hear the president talk about is the rationale, the reasoning that his own administration used when it went before the Supreme Court. If you remember, the Commerce Department basically said their rationale for this was that they were trying to protect the Voting Rights Act and minority voters. The Supreme Court didn't buy that. They basically said that this reasoning seems contrived. They said this seems more like a distraction than an explanation. You didn't hear the president talk about it at all. They've thrown that argument out the window, and now he's basically saying we really need an accurate count of citizen versus non-citizen, and I'm going to try to get it by any means I can, and therefore you now have this executive order. I thought one really interesting part is he said, I think he said Democrats, or he may have said they, he said they want to conceal the number of illegal aliens in the country, which I think really did kind of reveal a bit of the motivation behind this.
All right, let's listen to some of what the president just said about why he is issuing this executive order. Let's listen.
Previously available records, it could determine citizenship for 90% of our population or more. With today's executive order, which eliminates long-standing obstacles to data sharing, we're aiming to count everyone. Ultimately, this will allow us to have an even more complete count of citizens than through asking the single question alone. It will be, we think, far more accurate. The Census Bureau can use this.
So, Kim, the president here is saying that his executive order, which will gather all of this data from all these various agencies and departments, will give him an even clearer picture than he would have had with just the census question. So if that's the case, why not do this in the first place?
Well, it's hard to understand if what he really wants is what he's identifying as information about non-citizens. You have to ask ourselves, how is that piece of information getting to the federal government. It would have to be through some kind of application for benefits, maybe school records. So it's difficult to understand how he would think people that are undocumented would somehow have given information to the federal government that then could be accurately used for a count of non-citizens. But as I mentioned earlier, we already know, and the Supreme Court said this in its decision, that the Census Bureau has collected this kind of information in data collection efforts that don't count for purposes of the actual census. So as I indicated before, this is not going to move the legal ball anywhere. It's not going to move the ball in terms of the actual result of the census, which is constitutionally required and has huge implications. It does probably help the president's kind of script on this, and I'm sure many people are confused when they hear, why can't we ask about the census? And Mr. Barr is absolutely correct. The Supreme Court said there's nothing in the enumeration clause that bans this information from being collected. The point is, if it's going to be collected, it has to go through the proper legal hoops, the bells and whistles to do so. Now, the question is, had Mr. Wilbur Ross said, honestly, listen, if this is actually the case, and there's evidence suggesting it, we want this so that we can somehow disenfranchise, in some regard, non-citizens for purposes of the implications of the census. That is, if we don't count them because they're afraid to actually answer the census, there'll be lower numbers in states that have a lot of non-citizens. Those states will then lose in terms of the effects of the actual census. Now, if Mr. Ross had said that, I don't know whether the Supreme Court would have said that's not an okay answer if that had been from the beginning the rationale. But as was said earlier by my colleague, the whole voting rights idea was an after the fact, let's find an excuse. And the court said, when you're doing something this important, we need a better reason, because at the end of the day, we're talking about unelected people within the Commerce Department executing something that the Constitution authorizes Congress to do. Congress, yeah.
So Ben, I have a question now about the census. So we can assume that it will be printed on time now. It will not have the citizenship question. All questions surrounding that portion of it have been resolved. Is that correct?
Yeah, that ship had really already sailed before this event today. The census is currently being printed. This was not going to get on the census without some extraordinary measure that would have to take place for that to happen. But picking up on what Kim was just saying, there is a good chance at the White House, if their real rationale here is, and they have not said this publicly, but if their real rationale is here to disenfranchise people, to suppress turnout and participation with the census, they still may get what they were looking for. Simply by talking about this further, by confusing this issue, by muddying the waters, you have people who are just hearing bits and pieces of this. And if someone comes to your door and says, hey, I'm here with the United States government and we're doing the census, and if you are concerned that you might not have proper legal status or you're related to somebody who doesn't, you're probably not going to participate in the census. And a lot of people believe that is what the goal is here. Now, the White House has not said that, so we can't say that's exactly what they're doing, but that may, in fact, be the consequence.
So some of that damage may have already been done. Kim, I want to ask you about what the New York Times is also reporting, that ICE raids on thousands of undocumented immigrants nationwide are set to begin this weekend. The raids were postponed in June. So, Kim, what kind of legal challenges are you seeing in this case?
Well, I haven't been following that in terms of the legal challenges, but presumably there will be due process type challenges if someone is picked up and arrested. Legal immigrants do have constitutional rights in this country. I think that's something that most people don't understand. My guess would be that there are going to be public interest entities that decide that this overall, or at least seek to challenge the overall process, the procedure, as somehow unlawful. But I think the 1-2 punch of here's an executive order that is misunderstood in terms it will be, I would assume, Mr. Barr saying congratulations as if it's some kind of achievement in terms for the president when it comes to the citizenship question, which it is not. That coupled with raids this weekend could just create a chilling effect on non-citizens who are living in fear, and they're going to pull back. And that's really if the evidence that has been collected to some degree in the lower courts is to be believed, that is a rationale, or at least a benefit to the sort of more conservative Republican wing of the national political spectrum to have non-citizens not participate.
I did think that was interesting to note that the Attorney General congratulated the president not once but twice, maybe even more times, about this executive order. Kim Wehle, we thank you so much for joining us today and all of your insight. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Tanya.
Let's bring in now CBS News chief congressional correspondent Nancy Cordes. Turning back to the citizenship issue, Nancy, are Republicans supportive of the president's push to get this citizenship information? Do they see it as essential as he does?
They are more or less supportive, Tanya. Certainly there are members of the Republican rank and file who believe strongly, as he does, that this citizenship question belongs on the U.S. Census, that it is entirely appropriate to ask about it. But Republican leaders have really kept the entire issue at arm's length for weeks. They've said they don't really know much about it, that they support the president, but they really have not wholeheartedly embraced this fight. They simply don't see it as their fight. They didn't believe that it was going to be legally viable. They never saw how the administration was going to have time to fight it out in the courts and get this question on the census. They just felt that it was an uphill battle, and they acknowledged what many other legal experts have said, and certainly career officials at the Commerce Department have been saying for a couple of years now, which is that there are other ways to get this information if you really want to know how many U.S. citizens there are, how many people there are who are not in this country legally. So Republicans never turned on the president, but it simply wasn't their fight. And they felt that it was taking up a lot of oxygen and it wasn't going to be successful at the end of the day.
All right, so today, House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer announced the House will vote on criminal contempt for Attorney General William Barr and Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross. They ignored a subpoena seeking documents on the origins of the citizenship question on the census. So, Nancy, why push for criminal contempt?
Because they say that it reflects the seriousness of the lapses here, the fact that Congress has every right to ask for information, whether it is about how this citizenship question ended up on the census in the first place, even though it is no longer going to actually appear there because of this legal battle, or whether it has to do with questions of obstruction of justice and other controversies within the administration. They say that the Commerce Secretary, the Attorney General, can't just pick and choose when to comply with congressional requests and subpoenas. So they are going the criminal contempt route. It's the same route that Republicans took when they went after Attorney General Eric Holder back in 2012-2013 over the Fast and Furious controversy, knowing that it is probably not going to go anywhere in the courts, that DOJ is not going to mount some kind of criminal case against its own attorney general. But Democrats are trying to make the case here that that this is an administration that is stonewalling Congress, that is not allowing Congress to fulfill its oversight duties. And so, they're looking to throw the book at some of these administration officials any way they can. They also voted today in the House Judiciary Committee to issue subpoenas to a dozen current and former members of the president's inner circle. So they're looking to go after this administration any way that they can, because they simply don't know which of their efforts are going to be the first to be successful in enabling them to get some of the documents that they haven't been able to get just by asking for them.
Well, one successful subpoena is Robert Mueller's, and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said today that the former special counsel may stick to his report when he testifies before lawmakers next Wednesday, but she says she hopes the American people still get a better understanding of it. Let's listen to exactly what she said.
Members of Congress will honor our oath and do our patriotic duty to find the facts as Special Counsel Mueller comes to testify before Congress next week. This is about the dignity of the process. It's about patriotism. It's not about partisanship or politics.
So, Nancy, you were there at the House Speaker's weekly news conference. What are Democrats concerned about or looking forward to when they hear from Mueller?
Well, they're concerned about the fact that probably they're not all going to be able to ask the questions that they want to ask because there are strict time limits that are being placed on Mueller's appearances. He's only going to go before the House Judiciary Committee for about 2 hours. Same for the House Intelligence Committee. You're talking about, between these two committees, 60 or so lawmakers who are going to want to ask him questions. So you just do the math and you realize that some of the younger members, newer members in particular, are going to be left out in the cold. There's just not going to be time for them to grill Attorney General Mueller. So that is an ongoing frustration for Democrats. It even led the top Republican on the Judiciary Committee to say, you guys got rolled in these negotiations, basically making fun of Democrats, saying that they should have held out for more time if they were going to get Mueller here to Capitol Hill. So that's one issue. They still believe, however, that there is a huge value, a symbolic value, to having someone like Robert Mueller, who's seen as an independent arbiter, here on Capitol Hill talking about an obstruction of justice investigation into the president. Democrats believe that will have an impact on Americans who maybe didn't stop to read all 400-something pages of the Mueller report, but will hear somebody with the experience and gravitas of Robert Mueller talking about this for hours on end, all the potential instances of obstruction of justice that he and other federal prosecutors looked into to try to determine whether the president broke the law. Democrats think that there's a great deal of public relations value to that. At the same time, Tanya, they're really trying to downplay the notion that we're going to learn some blockbuster new piece of information next week. They know that Robert Mueller is, he's someone who goes by the book. If he says he is not going to go any further than what's in his report, they believe him. And so they don't think there'll be big bombshells necessarily, but they still think that there's a value to having him here.
All right, Nancy Cortez, thank you so much.
You're welcome.